This talk is focused on the art of ancient Egypt, and it features photos taken on a recent trip there with Viking. This first slide is a typical view we saw on our 7-day cruise along the River Nile. And this is a Google map of Egypt showing the Nile Delta, which is the triangle of green at the top or north end of the map. It also shows the narrow green strip of habitable land along the Nile. As you can see, the rest is desert. The places that we visited on the trip are indicated by the stars. Moving north to south, the blue star is Cairo, where we started, and then we flew to Luxor, indicated by the red star. From there, we cruised the Nile for 7 days between Luxor and Aswan, which is indicated by the green star, and the pink star at the bottom center indicates Abu Simbel, which was visited on a day trip by air from Aswan. So this schematic shows a very general timeline of Egyptian history. Evidence for the first major settlements throughout the region dates back to 6000 BCE, in the pre-dynastic period. Egyptian history began in 3000 BCE, so about 5,000 years ago, with the early dynastic period. The most important periods for most of the artifacts and structures addressed in this talk are the Old Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and the Greco-Roman periods. The pyramids date from the time of the Old Kingdom, which lasted 500 years between 2700 and 2200 BCE. Then over 600 years later, the New Kingdom emerged, dating from 1570 to 1080 BCE. So it also lasted about 500 years. During that period, this chart mentions Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramses. And I would also add Hatshepsut, the great female pharaoh, to that list. The New Kingdom marked Egypt's most powerful and prosperous time, and the period following it, unfortunately, was one of decline and political instability. The Greco-Roman period began about 750 years later in 330 BCE, when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt and established the Ptolemaic dynasty. Then about 350 years later, the Roman period began, when Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII were defeated in 31 AD at the Battle of Antietam. Queen Cleopatra VII was the last Egyptian pharaoh. So this image shows the major gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt. Egyptian art was a conservative tradition whose style changed very little over hundreds to thousands of years. One thing it's known for is its distinctive figure convention. Male figures, as shown here, are depicted with parted legs. The heads of all figures are typically seen from the side, but the torso is seen as from the front. Another convention is that males are depicted darker than females. The ancient Egyptian language had no word for art. Artworks were essentially functional and bound with religion and ideology. Works were unsigned, as there was no tradition of individual artistic expression. So when it comes to viewing the art of ancient Egypt today, we're talking mainly about temples, tombs, and museums filled with artifacts and sculptures. This is the Old Egyptian Museum in Cairo, which until recently was the main archaeological museum. But while we were there, the last of the objects from the tomb of Tutankhamun were being moved to a spectacular new venue called the Grand Egyptian Museum, or the GEM. So one of the most iconic images of ancient Egypt is a solid gold funerary mask which was placed over the mummy of Tutankhamun. The mummy and mask were encased in 3 nested coffins placed inside a stone sarcophagus. And this is the innermost coffin, which was also made of pure gold. And this is the stone sarcophagus, which held the 3 nested coffins. And it was further encased in 4 nested shrines. So Tutankhamun was born in 1341 BCE during the New Kingdom. He became a pharaoh at the age of 9 and died unexpectedly at the age of 18 or 19. Most royal tombs were robbed in antiquity, and although his was also disturbed, most of the original contexts were retained. The tomb was resealed in antiquity and remained so until it was discovered by Howard Carty in 1922 more than 3,000 years later. The tomb contained over 5,000 artifacts, many of which are magnificent treasures like this pendant, which is an example. As is this triple lamp, carved from a single piece of alabaster and representing a lotus growing in a pond. This golden throne, made of wood overlaid with sheet gold, depicts an intimate moment between the pharaoh and his wife. So the last few photos all came from this book, which I purchased in the mid-1970s after seeing the exhibit of 55 artifacts of Tutankhamun's that toured the U.S. at the time. So here are my photos of an alabaster chest from the tomb, and this is at the Egyptian Museum, and these contain the mummy's internal organs. The statues in the chest are of protective goddesses. So this is the gold funerary mask of Pharaoh Ramses I, and it dates from about 300 years after Tutankhamun. It was discovered in 1940 at the Royal Necropolis of Tanis. His tomb was the only one found completely intact, but only metal items survived. He had a spectacular coffin made of silver, which was more valuable than gold at the time. And it was placed within a black granite enclosure housed inside a red granite sarcophagus. And these next few slides are gold jewelry from his tomb. So this is a sculpture of a man that I found to be very lifelike, and I don't really have any other information about it. So the next several artworks all date from the Old Kingdom. So they're about 4,500 years old. This sculpture depicts the chief of the great estate, who was overseer of works, along with his wife and son. And this one depicts King Menkaure, who built the third pyramid at Giza, and he's shown between two goddesses. The great mother goddess Hathor is on his right, and on his left, there's a figure representing local goddesses, and she's shown beneath special symbols. This is a good example of how important symbolism was and how it was used. We recognize Hathor because she's crowned with the sun disk between two cow's horns, and the pharaoh is wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. And here's a fun fact about the pharaohs. The pharaohs' heads and bodies were shaved for hygiene and religious purity, so they wore elaborate wigs and fake beards because they had none of their own hair at all. They often married close relatives, often siblings. So this is a false door. It's made of limestone. It represents a symbolic gateway between the living and the dead, and it allowing the deceased spirit, which is called a ka, to travel to and from the tomb to receive offerings. And this is a detail of this very beautiful piece in the museum. And this is a quite famous statue. It's of Rahotep. He was a royal family member, and his consort, Nofret. And it's of painted limestone. Their eyes are very lifelike. They're of rock crystal. And note the difference in the skin tone. It shows the male darker, female lighter convention. And this is Senep and his family. And Senep was a dwarf who attained a high position in the royal court. His wife was a priestess. And besides using the male and female skin color convention, this statue also shows other conventions. One is that more important people, in this case the parents, are typically shown as larger. Besides being small, the children are also shown in a conventional way, which is that they are naked and their index finger is held to their mouth, and the male wears a side lock of hair. So now we're moving, still Old Kingdom. These are wooden statues. Very beautiful, I think. And this is a very realistic portrait of a man called Caper. He was a chief priest in charge of reciting prayers in temples and funerary chapels. The statue is of wood and again with eyes of rock crystal, calcite, and copper, and very realistic. And this is a very beautiful wooden relief of a man called Hesi-Ra. He is an Old Kingdom head of royal scribes, and he's shown carrying a scepter and a staff, which indicate his status, and also some writing materials. And this is a view of one of the halls in the museum. And a sculpture of the falcon god Horus protecting the prince. So note the child convention of the side lock and the finger to the mouth. So I just want to mention, before moving on, another wonderful new state-of-the-art museum in Cairo, and this is the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, which had some very interesting exhibits, like this one of Bedouin women's attire. And they also had this beautiful video display, which was changing and moving. Most importantly, this museum houses 20 royal mummies of 18 kings and 2 queens, and they're from the New Kingdom. And they were originally interned in the tombs in the Valley of the Kings at Luxor. No photos are allowed, but they are beautifully displayed in an expansive mummies hall. And most are unwrapped, so their head, hands, and feet are visible and just covered with a sheet. And the rest of the body is just covered with a sheet. It's admittedly a bit macabre, but also very touching and impressive, because these people, they were the rock stars of the ancient world. So dating hundreds of years earlier than those New Kingdom mummies that I just talked about are the pyramids near Cairo. And these were all tombs built during the Old Kingdom. And this is the oldest. It's the Great Step Pyramid of Saqquara, and it was built as a tomb for the Pharaoh Djoser, and it's over 4,700 years ago. And the pyramids of Giza, these were also tombs for pharaohs, and they were built about 100 to 200 years later than the Pyramid of Saqquara. And here's the Sphinx, of course. In another view, this one's showing a pyramid in the background. So after touring around Cairo, we flew down to Luxor to start a 7-day cruise. The Viking map is on the left, and our ship, the Viking Amun, is on the right. So Luxor was called Thebes in ancient times. And these are the ruins of the great temple of Karnak at Luxor. Although construction began about 1900 BCE, approximately 30 pharaohs continued to add to it over the next 2,000 years. This photo shows the massive gateway to the temple, which is called a pylon. But in front of that, it shows one end of the avenue of sphinxes. This was an originally 1.7 mile long avenue lined with 1,057 sphinxes and ram-headed statues. And it connected Karnak Temple with Luxor Temple. It was primarily built around 1400 BC, and it was expanded about 1,000 years later in the 4th century BC. So here's a detailed view showing some of the ram-headed statues. And these next slide are just a few views of the Karnak Temple. Lots of carved columns and statuary throughout. And this is another view of the Avenue of the Sphinxes, and this is between the two temples. And you can see there's a bridge for a road over it. So in general, Egyptian temples were laid out according to the fundamental plans shown here. The entrance was a great gateway called a pylon, and it was followed by a courtyard, then a hypostyle hall containing great pillars, and finally the sanctuary. Temples were often parts of great complexes with many side rooms and additional buildings, but these were fundamental features. And it's important to know that, amazingly, the common people never entered the temple. It was only for the pharaoh and the priests. The priests communicated with people outside of the pylon. So this is the pylon, or the gateway, of Luxor Temple. Its construction began about 500 years after that of Karnak, so around 1400 BCE, and again, this during the New Kingdom. And like Karnak, construction continued for centuries. So here's another view entering, and actually that's me entering the courtyard. And this is what remains of the hypostyle hall. And then there's the inner sanctuary and a lot of carving. Inside the sanctuary are examples of two types of carving. This first one is called sunken relief, and it's when the carvings are cut into the surface below the original face of the stone. And this is an example of a different type of carving. It's called low or bas relief, in which the figures and designs project slightly from the background, creating a three-dimensional effect. So this is another temple near Luxor. It's actually north of Luxor. This is the entrance to the hypostyle hall of the Dendera temple, which was dedicated to the great mother goddess Hathor. As I just said, it's located north of Luxor, and it was a site of worship as far back as about 2200 BCE. So that's during the Old Kingdom. But most of the present structure dates to the Greco-Roman period, so to about 350 BCE, so much more recent, but still over 2,000 years old. So the pylon is gone in this temple, and this view is from what's left of the courtyard, and it's looking towards the hypostyle hall. So this was a statue in the courtyard. It's of the god Bes, and he was a protector of newborns and children. So these are some views inside the temple, and I have to say this was my favorite temple. So I took, these photos. It was just fabulous, really. So this was a hall leading to the sanctuary, and unlike the previous hall, it has not been cleaned. Actually, so this is looking toward the sanctuary, and this is the hall that hasn't been cleaned. It still has soot stains from the fires of people who lived in the temple after it was no longer in use. And unfortunately, these new residents often defaced the temples and the carvings because they were superstitious and afraid that the old gods could harm them. So this is the innermost sanctum, and again, lots of carvings in there. And this particular temple is also famous for its carved zodiac, which at the site is only a reproduction. The original, which is shown here, was actually stolen and is now in the Louvre in Paris. So now we're moving to the Valley of Kings. This is located near Luxor. It holds over 60 royal tombs, all dating from the time of the New Kingdom. And the first tomb we visited was that of Ramses IV. And this is a schematic of the tomb. And it wasn't as big as some of the others, as you'll see. So this is what the entrances looked like. And now we'll have a few scenes from the inside. All original paint. And just really covered with images. So next we visited the tomb of Ramses III. And he was the father of the previous tomb occupant. And this tomb, as you can see from the schematic, actually was much larger. So at the entrance, there's a scene of the pharaoh with the falcon god Horus. And this is a walkway descending down into the tomb. And some details of these paintings along the walkway. The sky full of stars is a common motif in the tombs. And I love this scene. It's one of the most beautiful types of scenes, I think, in the Roman art. It's the scene of goddess Isis protecting the pharaoh by enclosing him in her wings. So these are some scenes even deeper in the tomb. And finally, here's one of the pharaoh. He's making offerings to Osiris, who is the god of the underworld or the afterlife. So next we visited the tomb of Tutankhamun, which was relatively small. And while all his treasures are now in the museums, his unwrapped mummy is actually still in the tomb and is laid out and on display. And these are just some of the wall paintings in the tomb. And finally, we visited the tomb of Seti I, the father of Ramses II, who is also known as Ramses the Great, which we're going to talk about a little more later. And this was another large tomb. Interestingly, it contained an unfinished room which had unpainted drawings. So these are just some scenes in the tomb. And that's the last one. Again, Horus the Pharaoh. So this is the mortuary temple of the great female pharaoh, Queen Hatshepsut. And she also died around 1450 BCE during the New Kingdom. And these are some paintings and carvings. Well, actually, this is the second view of the temple. Sorry. And this is paintings and carvings. A few scenes here. And there's the carvings. So it looked like a little more nature here in this temple. And this was part of the complex. It's a chapel dedicated to the goddess Hathor. And these are images of the queen herself. She dressed as a man, as a pharaoh, and she's wearing here a fake beard. So this is another one. This is the well-preserved hypostyle hall of a temple at Esna, and this is located south of Luxor. It was built in the Greco-Roman period, and so again around 2,000 years old. And it was dedicated to Khnum, the god of rebirth and creation. It has an astronomical themed ceiling containing signs of the zodiac. And there's another view of the outside. And views of the inside. And again, this temple was very beautiful, almost like Dendera. Each pillar capital had a unique representation of a lotus leaf. So the tops of the pillars there. And I think the zodiac symbols are shown here. So this is one of the temples of Abu Simbel. The temples were originally carved out of the mountainside during the reign of Ramses II for him and his wife, King Nefertari. He was also known as Ramses the Great, and he ruled for 66 years, the longest of any pharaoh, the time during which he conducted about 15 successful military campaigns. He had several consorts or wives and about 100 children, and he lived to the age of 90. Even so, with all his greatness, his temples were eventually forgotten and became buried under the sand until they were rediscovered in 1817. The four large statues are all of Ramses, and his wife, Nefertari, and children are depicted as smaller figures at his feet. Both temples were moved to higher ground in 1968 to avoid being submerged by the reservoir of Lake Nasser after completion of the Aswan High Dam. So this is the second temple, and this was dedicated to Mother Goddess Hathor. And this is a lovely scene inside the temple showing goddesses protecting Queen Nefertari. So these last three temples we're going to look at quickly. They all date from Greco-Roman times, about 1,000 years later. The first one is the great temple of the goddess Isis at Philae. And like Abu Simbel, it was also moved to avoid flooding from the Aswan Dam. It mostly dates from the Greek period of the Ptolemaic pharaohs. In the pylon shown here, Ptolemy XII is about to strike Egypt's enemies, protecting both Egypt and the temple. And this is a scene in the sanctuary showing the pharaoh making offerings to the goddess. And this is Kom Ombo temple, also from Greco-Roman times. And it's an unusual double temple as it was dedicated to the crocodile-headed god Sobek and the falcon-headed god Horus, both shown here. It's known as the House of the Crocodile and the Castle of the Falcon. And about 300 mummified crocodiles have been found at the site, and they are displayed in the museum there. And this is a particularly beautiful carving at that temple. It shows the pharaoh surrounded by various gods and goddesses. And finally, this is the pylon of the Edfu temple, also built during the Ptolemaic period, and it was dedicated to the falcon god Horus. This temple is filled with statues and inscriptions depicting his victory in an epic battle with his evil uncle Seth, who had murdered his father, the god Osiris. And there's a nice statue of the falcon. And this is the hypostyle hall, which also had not been cleaned and so is full of soot. And this is the sanctuary, which is beautiful. So for our last day, we returned to Cairo, where we visited the spectacular new Grand Egyptian Museum, or the GEM, which I mentioned earlier. And here's just a couple of views of the inside. So there's Grand Hall inside. There's many galleries, some of the artwork, decor, and a view looking from inside the museum at the pyramids. So ancient Egyptian art has undoubtedly had a great influence on Western art and design. This photo of a building built in 1828 in Paris is an example that in the early 19th century, Egyptian motifs were widely applied, and the influence continued into the 1920s with Art Deco. It's thought that Western interest in ancient Egyptian art began with Napoleon because he took a scientific expedition with him into Egypt, and that resulted in a series of publications. So another example is this current exhibition at the Institute of the Study of the Ancient World in New York City, and it addresses French sculptor Auguste Rodin's fascination with ancient Egypt. The show surveys the profound impact Egyptian art had on his artistic practice and his approach to the human form. It also showcases his enchantment with the Egyptian body, from the monumental figures of pharaohs to the anatomy of the gods depicted as human-animal hybrids. And finally, I just want to share a contemporary ancient Egypt influenced artwork that I've personally enjoyed and had hanging on my wall for many years. It's this Metropolitan Opera poster for the opera Aida. And finally, closing with the sunset on the Nile. And thank you for listening.